Picture a basketball player built like a fortress, a man who decided, somewhere deep in his bones, that nobody on this earth would ever push him around. He blocked shots like he was slamming a door in your face. He scowled at grown men until they flinched. For years, Alonzo Mourning was the wall the entire league ran into, a two-time Defensive Player of the Year, honored in 1999 and again in 2000, a giant who measured his own worth by how thoroughly he could dominate the man across from him. Then he met an opponent he couldn't intimidate, couldn't outmuscle, couldn't outwork. This one didn't care how many hours he spent in the gym or how loud he roared. It lived inside his own body. So hold this picture in your mind. It's June of 2006, Game 6 of the NBA Finals. And the most feared enforcer of his generation isn't starting. He's on the bench, waiting, and when he finally gets called in the biggest game of his life, he doesn't put up 30. He blocks 5 shots, a game high, grabs 6 rebounds, scores 8 points, and helps deliver a championship. Off the bench, as a role player. Now stop and ask the real question. How does a man like this, a franchise centerpiece, an all-star, a defensive monster, end up fighting for minutes on the bench? What happens between the roar and the reserve role? The answer runs through a doctor's warning, a controversial contract buyout, and a cousin willing to give up part of his own body. This is the story of a warrior who had to learn that strength isn't only about domination, that sometimes it means bending without breaking, accepting help, and playing a smaller role without becoming a smaller man. But to understand what that transformation cost him, we have to go back to Chesapeake, Virginia, and to a childhood shaped not only by instability, but by the first person who taught him what accepting help could look like. Alonzo Harding. Mourning Jr. was born on February 8, 1970. When his parents separated, he found himself in a courtroom facing a choice no child should have to make: live with his mother or live with his father. Mourning did not want to choose between them. Instead, at only 11 years old, he entered Virginia's foster care system. He passed through several homes before landing with Fanny Threet, a retired schoolteacher who spent her life opening her door to children who needed somewhere steady to stand. Mourning would later describe her with deep affection and call her Mom. She imposed rules, demanded accountability, and gave him something his life had been missing: structure that did not disappear when things became difficult. The easy version of this story would say, Mourning learned that he could rely on nobody. His experience with Fanny made the truth more complicated. He became fiercely self-reliant, but he also saw how one person's willingness to help could redirect an entire life. He would spend years emphasizing the first lesson. Much later, when his survival depended on another relative's generosity, the second would return with far greater weight. Basketball became the place where his need for control turned visible. At Indian River High School, the local kid grew into a national name. He was tall, powerful, and already playing with the confrontational edge that would follow him into the NBA. He blocked shots as if every attempt at the rim were a personal challenge. Opponents did not merely have to score over him, they had to convince themselves to keep trying. The winning followed. Mourning helped Indian River capture a state championship during a run in which the team won 51 consecutive games. That streak made the program a machine, and he was its most intimidating part, the player who could change an opponent's decisions before the ball ever left a shooter's hand. The foundation was already there: discipline from Fanny Threet, control found on the court, and a growing belief that effort could solve almost anything. That belief would carry him to the top of basketball. It would also become dangerously incomplete when effort finally met a problem it could not solve. By his senior year, Mourning averaged 25 points, 15 rebounds, and 12 block shots per game. The first 2 numbers established his talent. The third changed how opponents played. Every drive carried the risk that he would erase the shot and turn the possession into a warning for the next player. Mourning became the nation's #1 recruit in the 1988 class and collected Player of the Year honors from USA Today, Parade, Gatorade, and Naismith. The awards all said the same thing. The most coveted high school player in America was a center who could control a game before he ever touched the ball on offense. Every major program wanted him, but Georgetown under John Thompson offered the clearest lineage. Patrick Ewing had turned the school into the destination for intimidating defensive centers, and Thompson treated defense as an identity rather than one part of a game plan. Mourning arrived expecting to become the next name in that succession. The path changed when Thompson asked him to share the paint with another future Hall of Famer. Georgetown would have 2 extraordinary rim protectors and only 1 traditional center position. The first thing Alonzo Mourning did at Georgetown was announce himself to the entire country. As a freshman, he led the whole nation in blocked shots, 169 of them in total, a full 5 per game. Those were NCAA freshman records at the time, not conference records, not team records, national records set by an 18-year-old still learning the college game. He looked like exactly what everyone promised, the next great Georgetown center, the heir to the throne. The complication was already sitting a few seats away on the same bench. His name was Dikembe Mutombo, 7 feet 2 inches of length, timing, and potential. During Mourning's freshman season, Mutombo was still learning the American game and usually came off the bench behind him. But John Thompson soon realized that keeping one elite rim protector seated while the other played made little sense. Georgetown began putting both on the floor, creating the front line that fans called rejection row. The arrangement was spectacular in theory and awkward in practice. Mutombo was the more natural center, so Mourning spent long stretches operating as a power forward, farther from the basket than he preferred. The change did not make either player less talented, but it forced Mourning to defend different spaces and function without owning every inch of the paint. There is no need to invent a feud between them. Mourning and Mutombo pushed one another in practice and became part of the same Georgetown brotherhood. What changed was Mourning's control over his own place. For the first time, talent alone did not determine his exact role. He had to share territory that had always felt like his. He continued producing and kept his edge, yet the experiment never delivered the deep tournament run Georgetown expected from 2 future NBA stars. That disappointment gave the lesson a complicated ending. Mourning proved he could adjust, but he did not leave college believing that smaller roles were noble. He still wanted the middle, the responsibility, and the chance to show what he could do when the team unquestionably belonged to him. John Thompson understood that 2 young shot blockers could learn only so much from competing with each other. One day he arranged a surprise visit from Bill Russell, his former Boston Celtics teammate, and the standard by which defensive centers were measured. Mourning and Mutombo were still college players. Russell arrived with 11 NBA championships and an understanding of defense that went far beyond jumping at shots. The lesson was not simply how to block more attempts. Russell spoke to them about becoming anchors, communicating, controlling space, and making 4 teammates more secure because the center was behind them. Thompson had brought in a legend, but also a model of influence that did not depend on scoring totals or individual possession of the paint. Mourning kept a relationship with Russell long after Georgetown, extending the school's fraternity of defensive centers across generations. In 1991, Mutombo entered the NBA draft, leaving the center position to Mourning for his senior year. Mourning responded with his most complete college season, 21.3 points, 10.7 rebounds, and 5 blocks per game. He became a consensus first-team All-American and the Big East Player of the Year. After 2 seasons of adjusting his position beside Mutombo, he showed what Georgetown looked like when the middle belonged to him alone. And when you add up everything he did at Georgetown, the totals are staggering. He finished his college career with 2,001 points, 1,032 rebounds, and 453 blocked shots. That was one of the highest totals in college basketball history and ranked second in Georgetown's record book behind Patrick Ewing's 493. David Robinson had already recorded 516 at Navy. Mourning did not need an invented record to look extraordinary. His 4-year body of work had established him as one of the great defensive centers the college game had produced. The experience showed that Mourning could change positions when a roster required it. Miami would eventually ask for something more difficult than moving a few feet on the floor, accepting that the team no longer belonged to him while remaining ready to protect it. That test was still years away. In June of 1992, the only player certain to be selected ahead of Mourning was Shaquille O'Neal, 300 pounds of power and grace from Louisiana State, already redefining the physical possibilities of the position. Orlando took Shaq first. Charlotte called Mourning second, one place before celebrated Duke star Christian Lettner. The order looked like a draft night footnote: Shaq first, Mourning second. 13 years later, the same two centers would share a Miami locker room, with the player selected second being asked to protect the first one's lead rather than compete with him for status. Charlotte bet its future on him, and the rookie delivered immediately. He averaged 21 points, 10.3 rebounds, and 3.47 blocks a game, earning a place on the NBA All-Rookie team. The size and speed of professional basketball demanded adjustments, but intimidation was not one of them. That part of his game translated from the opening week. Less than a year later, with 0.4 of a second on the clock, a rookie would decide an entire playoff series. Charlotte in the early 1990s was basketball hungry. The Hornets were a young teal and purple expansion team looking for their first real taste of the postseason, and in the spring of 1993, they finally got there. Their first-round opponent was the Boston Celtics, the ghosts of the game, the franchise of banners and legends. For a young team, this was a rite of passage. By Game 4, the Hornets led the series 2-1 and had a chance to close it out at home. And the game came down to a single possession, the kind that gets replayed for decades. May 5, 1993. The score, 103-101, Boston clinging to a lead in the final seconds. Charlotte set the final play, and the ball found the rookie. Mourning, a man built to block shots and bully the paint, rose from 20 feet, hardly his signature territory, and buried the jumper with 0.4 of a second left. 104-103, Charlotte. The building came unglued. The Hornets had won the game and the series, 3-1, securing the first playoff series victory in franchise history. The shot expanded the way people saw him. A rookie known for defense and physical force had ended a playoff series with touch, timing, and complete offensive nerve. In one possession, he went from feared enforcer to Charlotte folk hero. The young franchise did not merely have a promising center. It had a star associated forever with its first postseason triumph. He would go on to finish second in Rookie of the Year, voting that season, once again, right behind Shaquille O'Neal, the same shadow that trailed him from draft night. But in Charlotte, none of that mattered. He was theirs. He was the future. He was the man who'd hit the shot. Everything appeared to be building toward a long partnership. By 1995, however, money, status, and the limits of Charlotte's plans were pulling it apart. The Hornets offered a 7-year extension, averaging roughly $11.2 million per season. Mourning believed an elite center entering his prime was worth more, and rejected it. That standoff broke the relationship. Once a franchise player decides he won't sign, the clock starts ticking, and a team has to make a hard choice: keep an unhappy star and risk losing him for nothing, or trade him while he still holds maximum value. Charlotte chose to trade him. On November 3, 1995, the Hornets sent Mourning to the Miami Heat. In return, Charlotte received Glenn Rice, a genuine scoring star, along with Matt Geiger, Khalid Reeves, and a first-round pick in the 1996 draft. It was a blockbuster, the kind of trade that reshapes two franchises at once. Charlotte got proven pieces. Miami got a cornerstone. The split complicated the image Charlotte had embraced. Mourning wanted to remain, but affection could not bridge the distance between his valuation and the team's. His career changed through the coldest mechanism in professional sports. Each side protected its leverage until a trade became the only workable outcome. The gamble paid off almost immediately. In July of 1996, Mourning signed a 7-year contract with Miami worth $105 million, one of the landmark deals of the entire era. He'd bet on his own value and won big. And more than that, he'd found a home. Miami wasn't just the team that paid him. It was about to become the place his whole story kept returning to through triumph and through crisis. In Miami, he wasn't just paid like a star. He was about to build one of the most feared defensive reputations in the entire league. Miami in the mid-1990s was becoming something serious, and Alonzo Mourning was the anchor. Under the leadership of coach Pat Riley, a man who prized toughness above almost everything, Mourning found the perfect environment for who he already was. Riley wanted a team that defended like its life depended on it, that made every possession a war. Mourning didn't just fit that vision, he was that vision. The results came fast. In the 1996 through 97 season, the Heat won 61 games, a franchise record at the time, and finished second in the Eastern Conference. For a team that had spent its early years searching for relevance, 61 wins was an announcement. Miami had arrived, and the man in the middle was the reason opponents dreaded coming into that building. But regular season authority was only part of the job. In the East, Miami's path kept running through New York, the franchise Pat Riley had left behind. The Heat and Knicks shared his defensive DNA: slow games, hard fouls, crowded paint, and the conviction that every loose ball was worth a confrontation. Their playoff meetings did not feel like entertainment. They felt like arguments over which team had inherited Riley's identity. In 1997, Miami fell behind New York 3-1 in the conference semifinals. Then Game 5 erupted. Heat forward P.J. Brown lifted Charlie Ward and threw him toward the baseline after a boxout. Knicks players left the bench, and the resulting suspensions stripped New York's rotation across the next 2 games. Miami came back to win the series in 7. The Heat had survived their bitterest rival, only to run into Michael Jordan's Bulls and lose the Eastern Conference Finals in 5 games. That should have been the beginning of repeated championship runs. Instead, New York became the recurring wound in Mourning's prime. In 1998, the teams met again in the first round. The deciding 5th game ended with Miami eliminated and Mourning trading punches with former Charlotte teammate Larry Johnson. Knicks coach Jeff Van Gundy wrapped himself around Mourning's leg in the middle of the fight, creating one of the strangest images of the decade. The most intimidating center in basketball trying to move while an opposing coach clung to his ankle. The moment captured both the appeal and the limitation of Mourning's intensity. His fury made Miami believable against anyone. It could also consume him when control mattered most. The Heat were not losing because he lacked commitment. If anything, the emotion sometimes burned too hot. The lockout-shortened 1998 through 99 season became Mourning's individual summit. He led the league with 3.9 blocks per game, won his first Defensive Player of the Year award, and carried Miami to the #1 seed in the Eastern Conference. New York entered the playoffs 8th. In the final seconds of the deciding Game 5, Allen Houston's runner bounced off the front rim, kissed the backboard, and dropped through. The 8th seed eliminated the 1st seed by 1 point. The Knicks continued all the way to the NBA Finals. Mourning went home with the league's highest defensive honor and proof that the best season of his life could still end in the first round. He returned the next season and did it again. 3.7 blocks per game and a second consecutive Defensive Player of the Year award. Miami could build an entire system around the ground he protected. His methods appeared completely validated: demand more from the body, concede nothing in the paint, and force every opponent to experience the game on his terms. The spring of 2000 brought one more collision with New York. This time, Miami pushed the conference semifinals to a 7th game at home. Again, the margin was 1 point. Again, the Knicks advanced. Across 4 consecutive postseasons, the Heat had faced New York 4 times and been eliminated 3 times. Mourning entered the summer with 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, an Olympic roster spot, and no trip to the NBA Finals. Those defeats explain why the championship chase mattered long before illness entered the story. Mourning had already spent his prime absorbing suspensions, 1-point eliminations, and unfinished seasons. In the fall of 2000, Olympic gold in Sydney appeared to reset everything. He was a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year at the height of his profession. Privately, his body was behaving in ways he could not explain. Mourning later remembered extreme fatigue and swelling in his legs and feet. The symptoms did not match his conditioning, but he blamed the workload and kept moving. The habits that helped an athlete play through soreness made it easier to dismiss a warning that required a completely different response. A routine preseason physical ended the guessing. Tests found abnormalities in his kidneys, and the follow-up appointment introduced a name almost no basketball fan knew: focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, or FSGS. The disease scars the microscopic filters inside the kidneys, gradually reducing their ability to clean the blood. Mourning looked at the doctor and asked the question underneath every other question: "Am I going to die?" The doctor paused. Mourning would remember that silence as clearly as the answer. There was no known cure, he was told, and within 10 to 12 months, he could be on dialysis. One of the best-conditioned athletes in the world was being warned that a machine might soon have to perform a basic function his body could no longer manage. He later described the moment as deflating. Much of the fear came from ignorance. Basketball opponents arrived on film with habits to study and weaknesses to attack. FSGS arrived as an unfamiliar acronym and a future he could not picture. Mourning began learning the vocabulary of kidney function, medication, dialysis, and risk. Information could help him prepare, but it could not promise control. Mourning refused to treat the doctor's projection as an automatic retirement. Medication, diet, and constant monitoring became part of his routine. On March 27, 2001, after missing most of the season, he returned for Miami. He appeared in the final 13 games. The first comeback was real, but it was also fragile. Charlotte swept the Heat from the playoffs, and Mourning was still learning what his body could provide from one week to the next. The following season, he played 75 games. He averaged 15.7 points, 8.4 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks, earning the final All-Star selection of his career. The numbers were remarkable for a player managing serious kidney disease, but they also showed the distance from his peak. Miami missed the playoffs, and the body that once offered certainty now had to be negotiated with every day. The 2002 through 2003 season became a complete stop. Mourning missed the entire year while dealing with the disorder. No block totals, no All-Star weekend, no game schedule to make the weeks feel normal. Only treatment, uncertainty, and the unresolved question of whether basketball was still part of his future. In July of 2003, the New Jersey Nets offered another opening. They had reached back-to-back finals and gave Mourning a 4-year contract. The agreement suggested a second act, a new uniform, a contender, and another route toward the championship Miami had never reached. It lasted 12 games. His kidney function deteriorated so sharply that continuing was no longer a competitive decision. The night before the public announcement, Mourning called Nets star Jason Kidd. Kidd later remembered a surprisingly soft voice on the phone. Mourning's concern was not primarily what retirement meant for him. He worried that he had let Kidd and the team down only months after promising to help them win a championship. On November 24, 2003, Mourning stood before the cameras and announced that he had to stop playing. His health had moved beyond preserving a career. He needed a kidney transplant to preserve his life. At almost the same moment, a family connection was being restored hundreds of miles away. Mourning's second cousin, Jason Cooper, was visiting their gravely ill grandmother in a Virginia hospital. The two cousins had not seen each other in more than 20 years. While Cooper stood in the room with Mourning's father, SportsCenter reported that Alonzo was leaving basketball because he needed a kidney. Cooper looked at Mourning's father and offered to be tested. About a week later, their grandmother died. During the days surrounding her funeral, the family learned that Cooper was compatible. Mourning would later describe the connection in the simplest terms. His grandmother's death had brought him life. Other friends and relatives had offered help. Patrick Ewing, his Georgetown brother and longtime rival, had publicly said he would donate if he proved to be a match. In the end, Cooper, the cousin who had reappeared at a hospital bedside, became the donor. On December 19, 2003, surgeons transplanted Cooper's left kidney into Mourning. The body Mourning had built through thousands of hours of work could continue only because another person had volunteered part of his own. Recovery still demanded Mourning's discipline, but survival itself had become a shared achievement. A transplanted kidney requires lifelong medication, monitoring, and the knowledge that rejection remains possible. Mourning began working toward basketball again within those conditions, no longer treating medical supervision as an insult to his toughness. The road back would pass through New Jersey, a controversial trade, and a buyout that left Toronto fans with every reason to feel angry. By late 2004, he was attempting a return with the Nets, and that's when the business of basketball intervened in a way that turned strange. In December of 2004, Mourning was included in the blockbuster trade that sent Vince Carter to New Jersey, a deal that shipped Mourning, Aaron Williams, Eric Williams, and 2 first-round picks to the Toronto Raptors. He never played for Toronto. The Raptors said his medical condition prevented him from becoming part of their plans, while Mourning wanted to continue his comeback with a contender. To Toronto supporters, the distinction offered little comfort. Their franchise had just traded away Vince Carter, and one of the most recognizable names in the return would not wear the uniform even once. The episode belongs in this story because resilience does not make every decision above criticism. Mourning was protecting the ending he wanted. Raptors fans saw a star rejecting their team before giving it a chance. Both truths can exist at once. On February 11, 2005, the sides reached a buyout. Mourning accepted approximately $6 million less than the full amount remaining on his contract and became a free agent. The settlement still paid him millions, so it would be misleading to describe what followed as walking away from the entire buyout. The meaningful choice came next. He signed with the Miami Heat for the veteran's minimum. More lucrative possibilities were no longer the priority. He wanted familiar doctors, a familiar organization, a contender, and the chance to finish a relationship with Miami that illness had interrupted. The businessman who once fought Charlotte over his market value was now willing to let role and belonging determine the decision. Back in Miami, he'd have to swallow the hardest pill of all, playing backup to the one man who was drafted ahead of him 13 years earlier. Draft night, 1992, Shaquille O'Neal first, Alonzo Mourning second. 13 years later, that old order returned with a strange symmetry. The Heat's starting center was Shaquille O'Neal. Mourning, the 7-time All-Star and former franchise cornerstone, was now backing up the player drafted one position ahead of him. Their history gave the arrangement extra weight. Shaq would later identify Mourning as perhaps his toughest opponent during his first years in the league. Miami was asking 2 former rivals to divide one position without turning old comparisons into a daily contest. There was no expectation that Mourning would eventually reclaim the franchise from O'Neal. His job was to change the temperature when Shaq rested, collected fouls, or needed help protecting the paint. That demanded a different kind of preparation, long stretches of watching followed by a few minutes in which hesitation could ruin the entire purpose of putting him in. The first evidence came during the 2005 playoffs. Mourning had joined Miami in March and was still learning the limits of his rebuilt body. Yet his defense helped the Heat reach Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals. Detroit ended the run, leaving him close enough to a finals appearance to make one more season irresistible. During the 2005 through 2006 regular season, Mourning appeared in 65 games and started 20. He averaged 7.8 points and 5.5 rebounds, modest production beside his old all-star numbers. At 2.7 blocks per game, however, he finished third in the entire league while playing barely half the minutes of a full-time star. The timing and appetite for the ball at the rim were still there. Mourning compressed his old aggression into shorter shifts, attacking every drive as if he might not receive another opportunity that night. Miami did not need him to recreate the offense of his prime. It needed the score to become harder for the opponent whenever number 33 checked in. That arrangement carried Miami toward one night in June. In the spring of 2006, the Heat reached the first finals in franchise history and promptly fell behind Dallas 2-0. The road to that June had been a grind. Miami climbed past the Chicago Bulls, then the New Jersey Nets, the franchise that had once tried to build a comeback around him, and then survived the Detroit Pistons, one of the toughest defensive outfits of the era. After 3 rounds, the Heat stood somewhere the organization had never been. It was also the first finals Mourning had reached in a career stretching back to 1992. Then the series opened, and it looked like a disaster. Dallas won the first 2 games, 2-0, with the Mavericks holding home court and all the momentum. For a man who had waited 14 years and survived a life-threatening illness just to get here, watching a title slip away in the opening week must have felt unbearable. But Miami didn't fold. They won Game 3, then Game 4, then Game 5, 3 straight victories that flipped the entire series on its head. Game 6 offered the chance to make it 4 and finish the job in Dallas. Mourning began Game 6, where he had begun most games that season, on the bench. When Pat Riley removed O'Neal, Mourning met Shaq with a promise. "I got you, big dog. You carried us this far." Then he entered the biggest game of his life and made the promise visible. He scored 8 points, collected 6 rebounds, and blocked 5 shots, more than anyone else in the game. On one of them, Jason Terry appeared to have an open path in transition until Mourning chased the play down and erased the layup at the glass. He landed roaring, fists tight, looking for a few seconds exactly like the defender who had ruled Miami's paint before the diagnosis. Shaq later remembered that burst as some of the finest minutes he had seen from an older center. Mourning played just over 14 minutes in the clincher, but Miami won the championship with the rim protected whenever those minutes demanded it. He did not have to resemble his younger self for an entire night. He only had to be unmistakably himself at the correct moment. The championship restored more than a missing line on Mourning's resume. It also restored his value around the league, and teams with more money began calling. Winning changes a player's market. Suddenly, the ring-chasing veteran who'd signed for the minimum was a proven champion again, and other teams came calling with real money. Among them were the San Antonio Spurs, a perennial contender who could have offered Mourning both a bigger paycheck and another legitimate shot at a title. He turned them down and returned to Miami for the 2006 through 2007 season, taking less than what was available elsewhere. At 25, his contract had needed to reflect his status. At 36, remaining with the organization that had shared both the crisis and the championship mattered more than the larger offer. Then he decided the clock was running out on his own terms. In 2007, Mourning announced that the coming season, his 15th in the league, would be the end. "It will definitely be my last year," he said, a man choosing at long last to write his own ending instead of letting the disease write it for him. The game still refused to follow his preferred ending. On December 19, 2007, Atlanta guard Mario West drove toward the basket. Mourning rotated into the lane to challenge the shot, the same movement he had made thousands of times. No opponent crashed into him. His right knee simply buckled, and the patellar tendon tore. Pat Riley and Miami's trainers came onto the floor with a stretcher. Mourning refused it. The man who had accepted doctors, medication, a donated kidney, and a reserve role still wanted one final choice. He would not be wheeled away from a basketball court. With people supporting his weight, he pulled himself upright and left on his feet. Only afterward did the date reveal its extraordinary symmetry. Exactly 4 years earlier, on December 19th, surgeons had completed the kidney transplant that extended his life. The anniversary of the operation became the night a different part of his body ended his career. For years, the fear had been that kidney disease would take basketball from him. Instead, his last appearance ended with an ordinary athletic catastrophe, a tendon failing while he tried to block one more shot. The disease did not receive the final image. Mourning did, injured, supported by others, and still insisting on how he would leave the floor. It would take more than a year before he finally stood at a podium to make it official. And the words he chose said everything about how he now measured himself. On January 22, 2009, Alonzo Mourning made it official. Standing before the press, he closed the book on a career that had spanned parts of 3 decades. And listen to how he framed it. At 38, he said, "I feel like I've physically done all I can for this game. Physically done all I can." That's the language of a man completely at peace with his body's limits. The same body he had once tried to bully past every warning sign. The same body he had begged a doctor not to give up on. The kid from Virginia, who measured himself by pure physical domination, was now measuring himself by whether he'd given everything he had. And he had. Every last bit of it. Miami answered in the only way that fit. On March 30th, 2009, the Heat raised his number 33 to the rafters, making Alonzo Mourning the first player in franchise history to have his jersey retired. The honor recognized the blocks and all-star selections, but also the identity he helped give a young organization. Before Miami became a regular destination for superstars, Mourning had made defense, endurance, and confrontation part of the franchise's language. He wasn't finished with the franchise either. Later that year, Mourning rejoined the Heat organization as Vice President of Player Programs and Development, a role built around mentoring young players and leading community outreach. The man who had once needed the entire world to bend to his will was now the steady hand, guiding the next generation, teaching them things about the game and about life that no box score could hold. And the giving had started long before retirement. Back in 1997, at the peak of his powers, he had founded Alonzo Mourning Charities to help children and families in at-risk situations, the kind of situations that echoed the hard beginnings of his own early life. That work only deepened once basketball was behind him. In 2003, during the same year his playing career appeared to be ending, Mourning and real estate developer Martin Margulies founded the Overtown Youth Center in Miami. The purpose was not a single holiday event or a brief appearance by a famous athlete. It was designed as a safe, lasting place for children and families in Overtown and nearby communities, with academic support, mentoring, health programs, and guidance that could continue as a child grew older. The connection to Fanny Threet is difficult to miss. She had changed Mourning's direction by making stability available every day, not by delivering one inspirational speech. The center applied the same principle on a larger scale. Build a place, keep the doors open, set expectations, and remain present long enough for help to become structure. His most enduring defensive project was no longer protecting a rim. It was giving young people somewhere safer to stand. In August of 2014, Alonzo Mourning entered the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. The ceremony could have functioned as one final inventory of individual achievements. 7 All-Star selections, 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, more than 2,000 career blocks, and a championship. Mourning consistently directed the story toward the people standing behind those numbers. He returned to 3 men in particular. John Thompson had taught him that Georgetown's responsibility extended beyond basketball. Jason Cooper had made the rest of his life physically possible. Pat Riley had demanded professionalism at Mourning's peak and patience after the transplant, then found a role in which the former star could finally become a champion. When Mourning learned that the Hall of Fame had selected him, Cooper was among his first phone calls. Mourning told his cousin that he loved him and thanked him again because there could be no induction speech, no championship memory, and no years of community work without the decision Cooper had made in a Virginia hospital. The call placed the honor where Mourning believed it belonged, not at the end of one man's climb, but inside the network of people who had carried him there. More than 20 years after the transplant, another medical chapter reminded him why those years of advocacy mattered. In early 2024, routine screening led to a diagnosis of high-grade stage 3 prostate cancer. Mourning had no symptoms. Without the blood test, he later explained, he might have continued living normally while the disease progressed unnoticed. He underwent surgery in March. Additional testing found that the cancer had not spread beyond the prostate capsule, and in June, he announced that he was cancer-free. The point of the story was not that toughness had defeated another opponent. Mourning emphasized almost the opposite. Screening, information, physicians, and early action had given him options. That distinction shows how far his understanding of strength had traveled. In 2000, he initially ignored swelling and exhaustion because he trusted his ability to push through discomfort. In 2024, he used his experience to tell other men not to wait for pain, not to confuse silence with health, and not to let fear keep them away from a test. He had already become a public voice for kidney disease awareness. Now he spoke openly about prostate cancer as well, particularly the risks faced by Black men and the value of regular screening. The player who once tried to hide every sign of vulnerability was using the most private parts of his medical history to make strangers less afraid of confronting their own. So, return one last time to Chesapeake. An 11-year-old boy entered foster care rather than choose between his parents, and Fanny Threet gave him a stable home. Decades later, Jason Cooper gave him a kidney. Pat Riley gave him a place to return, and Mourning gave Miami whatever remained in his body, even when that meant waiting behind Shaquille O'Neal for 14 minutes in the game that completed his career. None of those acts made him less responsible for what followed. He still had to obey the rules in Fanny's house, endure the transplant recovery, earn his minutes, and protect the rim when the championship was within reach. But his life was never the work of one immovable man. It was a chain of people carrying one another at the moment the next step became impossible, alone. Alonzo Mourning entered basketball believing strength meant that nobody could move him. He left behind a more difficult definition: know when to stand your ground, know when to accept another person's hand, and use the life you are given to make the path safer for everyone coming after you.